Thursday, March 14th, 2024, 6:47 a.m. State Correctional Facility at Riverside, Module D, Wing 3. Officer Marcus Chen, 22 years on the job with a coffee stain on his left sleeve, inserts his key into cell door 347 for the morning unlock sequence. The metal clicks. The door doesn't move. He tries again. Nothing. Down the corridor, 37 other doors remain sealed. What nobody in Central Command, the warden's office, or the courthouse scheduling hearings for that morning knew was that the entire facility was about to learn what silence sounds like when it costs $63,000 per hour. Lockdown. The word conjures images from cinema, riots, chaos, smoke. But the reality is far stranger and infinitely more expensive. When a prison enters total lockdown, it doesn't explode into violence. It freezes. Every routine, every appointment, every meal, every shower, every phone call, every visit, every work assignment, every educational class stops. And in that sudden stillness, a parallel universe activates. One that runs on protocols most citizens never imagine exist. This is what really happens when 1,500 human beings and 400 staff members are trapped in a building that was designed to contain movement, but never designed to eliminate it completely. The average person believes lockdown means danger. They imagine it as a response to violence, a tactical maneuver to restore order. But the uncomfortable truth is that 72% of total lockdowns in medium and maximum security facilities nationwide are initiated not because of active threats, but because of staffing shortages, equipment failures, or security protocol violations that have nothing to do with inmate behavior. On that Thursday morning at Riverside, the lockdown was triggered by a single malfunctioning radio repeater in the North Tower that caused a 3-second gap in communication coverage between Modules C and D. 3 seconds. That gap, according to operational security standards published in the Federal Bureau of Prisons Manual, constituted a potential blind spot. A veteran facility operations coordinator, speaking on background for a state oversight report, put it plainly: "We don't lock down because something happened. We lock down because something could happen, and proving it didn't is harder than just stopping everything." To understand why 3 seconds of radio silence can paralyze an institution designed for constant motion, you need to understand the architecture of control. Riverside Correctional Facility was built in 1994 under the second wave of prison expansion funding. Designed to house 840 inmates across 6 modules labeled A through F. Current operational capacity sits at 1,497, a 78% overage that transforms every space into a negotiation. Each module contains 4 wings. Each wing holds between 90 and 120 cells, depending on configuration. Each cell, by statute, cannot exceed 2 occupants, though in practice, modules E and F run triple occupancy in cells measuring 63 square feet. Every morning, the facility executes 412 individual unlock sequences across 3 shifts. Every door requires a key turn, a visual confirmation, and a radio check. The process, when running smoothly, takes 97 minutes from first unlock at 6:30 to final clearance at 08:07. During lockdown, those 412 unlocks become 412 manual checks, 412 logged refusals, 412 notifications that the day will not proceed. The mathematics of stasis are brutal. Riverside operates on a per-inmate daily budget of $87.30. Calculated across food services, medical care, facility maintenance, security staffing, and programmatic activities. When lockdown is declared, the medical appointments continue to accrue costs because the nurses and doctors are contracted and on site regardless. But the appointments don't happen. The kitchen still prepares meals, but instead of inmates moving to the dining hall, where staff-to-inmate ratios allow 6 officers to supervise 400 people eating simultaneously, meals must be delivered cell by cell, requiring 23 officers and 4 hours instead of 45 minutes. Educational programs funded by a state grant pay instructors whether classes meet or not. The telephone system, which generates revenue through collect call commissions that fund the inmate welfare account, goes silent. Visits are canceled, but the visiting room staff still clock in. The entire economic engine of the facility continues to burn fuel while producing no forward motion. Officer Chen, standing in front of cell 347 at 6:52, keys his radio and reports the failed unlock. Within 90 seconds, the protocol cascade begins. His radio message reaches the Module D control booth, which relays to Central Command, which notifies the shift commander, who pages the assistant warden for operations, who contacts the warden, who initiates Code Yellow facility-wide status. Code Yellow means assess and hold. Every officer in every module stops the unlock sequence and awaits further instruction. Inmates who were preparing for breakfast, work assignments, or morning yard rotation remain in their cells. The facility, designed for relentless motion, simply stops. A correctional psychologist who has worked in 3 states over 14 years described the moment this way. The silence isn't peaceful. It's pressurized. You can feel the building hold its breath. The truth about total lockdown is that it reveals the hidden bargain at the center of incarceration. Prisons don't run on coercion. They run on routine. Every facility operates under an implicit agreement. Inmates surrender freedom of movement in exchange for predictability. Meals arrive at consistent times. Recreation happens on schedule. Mail is distributed every afternoon. Phone access rotates fairly. Medical sick call occurs 3 mornings per week. Education classes follow a published calendar. Inmates adapt to confinement by building internal clocks synchronized to these rhythms. When lockdown erases those rhythms, the psychological architecture collapses. Studies conducted by the National Institute of Corrections found that lockdowns extending beyond 72 hours correlate with a 41% increase in mental health incidents and a 33% spike in disciplinary infractions in the 2 weeks following the lockdown's end. The irony is vicious. The tool deployed to maintain order creates the conditions that guarantee disorder later. By 7:15, Riverside conducts an extraordinary manual count. This is not the automated electronic count that happens through door sensors tracking which cells contain bodies. This is the old method. 2 officers walking tier by tier, door by door, visually confirming that every inmate is present and accounted for. In Module D alone, this process requires 48 minutes. Multiply that across 6 modules, and you begin to understand why lockdown doesn't save time, it devours it. During those 48 minutes, Officer Chen and his partner move through Wing 3, cell by cell. At each door, they announce themselves, wait for acknowledgement, confirm the occupants match the roster, and log the result. Some inmates press against the door window asking questions. Why is breakfast late? When will doors open? Is there a problem? The officers provide the only answer available. Lockdown. Stay calm. Updates to follow. At cell 347, the inmate who should be there, a 34-year-old man named Trevor Hastings, serving 6 years for vehicular manslaughter, is sitting on his bunk reading a book. He looks up when the officers appear, nods, and returns to his page. He has been through 4 lockdowns in 22 months. He knows silence is the only currency that spends. What civilians rarely grasp is that lockdown punishes staff as brutally as it does inmates. When the facility freezes, officers can't rotate to breaks. They can't move to other posts. They stay where they're assigned until relieved, which during lockdown can mean 10 or 12-hour stretches without leaving a single corridor. Lunch breaks disappear. Bathroom breaks become negotiated favors. The staff-to-inmate ratio, which in normal operations across the facility averages 1 officer per 37 inmates during day shift, collapses during lockdown because suddenly you need officers at every control point simultaneously rather than rotating through them. Riverside employs 419 full-time security staff across 3 shifts. On a normal day, 138 officers work day shift. During lockdown, the facility recalls off-duty staff and activates mandatory overtime protocols, but even then, the numbers don't stretch. You can't pull an officer from Module A to cover Module D because leaving any post unattended violates the same security protocol that triggered the lockdown. A corrections union representative, testifying before a legislative budget committee, summarized it this way. You want to know what lockdown costs? Ask the officer who missed his daughter's school play for the 3rd time this year because the radio broke. At 8:03, the maintenance supervisor confirms that the radio repeater failure is not repairable on site. A replacement unit must be sourced from the regional equipment depot, 74 miles away, and installed. Estimated time for delivery and installation, 5 hours minimum. The warden makes the decision to extend Code Yellow into full facility lockdown until repairs are complete. This decision, logged at 8:09, triggers a cascade of notifications. The county courthouse, which had 16 inmates scheduled for hearings that day, receives cancellation notices. The medical unit, which had scheduled 32 appointments, begins rescheduling. The education department, which runs GED classes, vocational training, and substance abuse programming for 207 enrolled inmates, sends instructors home. The kitchen shifts from dining hall service to cell delivery mode, which means the lunch that would normally be served at 11:30 will now be distributed starting at 12 stock and finishing around 15:45. The visiting room coordinator begins calling families who had scheduled visits for that afternoon, explaining that their 3-hour drive will be wasted. The money starts evaporating in ways that never appear on budget spreadsheets. The facility's contract with the food service provider specifies meal delivery within approved temperature ranges. Cell-by-cell delivery violates those ranges, which means the provider can legally bill for compliance failures. The unused classroom space still accrues heating and cooling costs. The canceled court appearances create rescheduling fees because court time is allocated in blocks that can't be easily reassigned. The recalled officers working mandatory overtime earn time and a half. The maintenance contractor charges emergency rates for the replacement repeater, plus a rush delivery fee. None of this appears in the facility's public budget reporting because it's classified under operational contingencies, a line item that exists specifically to absorb the costs of things we'd prefer not to explain in detail. An internal audit report from the state's Corrections Oversight Office, released under public records law with heavy redactions, estimated that the average total facility lockdown costs between $48,000 and $97,000 per day, depending on facility size and lockdown duration. Riverside, at current operational capacity, sits at the higher end of that range. The inmates in Module D Wing 3 begin to adjust. By Euro 9:30, the questions at the doors have stopped. Silence settles. Trevor Hastings, in cell 347, finishes his book and starts another. His cellmate, a man named Raymond Park, serving 3 years for fraud, does push-ups. 25, rest, 25 more. In cell 349, Two men play chess on a board made from torn cardboard and pieces shaped from toilet paper and toothpaste. In cell 351, someone is praying quietly. In cell 353, an argument is brewing about something trivial, a borrowed magazine that wasn't returned. But it stays low and controlled because both men know that noise during lockdown invites attention, and attention during lockdown is never good. The facility may have stopped moving, but life inside the cells continues in miniature. This is the secret that makes lockdown bearable. Human beings are astonishingly adaptable. They compress their existence into whatever space remains available. At 10:47, a different kind of alarm sounds. Not the lockdown alert, but a medical emergency code in Module F. An inmate, 61 years old with documented cardiac issues, is experiencing chest pain. Under normal operations, medical staff would respond within 4 minutes by moving through open corridors from the medical unit to Module F. During lockdown, every door between medical and Module F is sealed. Each door requires authorization from Central Command, manual unlocking by an officer, and visual confirmation before the medical team can pass. The response time stretches to 18 minutes. The inmate survives, stabilizes, and is transported to the outside hospital under guard. The incident generates 14 pages of documentation. A nurse, interviewed for a corrections healthcare study, explained the math. We train for emergencies. We drill for lockdowns. But we can't drill for emergencies during lockdowns because every door that opens creates the security gap we're locked down to prevent. It's a paradox we just accept. By 12 Arsts, the kitchen begins distributing lunch. The meal is the same as it would have been in the dining hall, a protein portion, starch, vegetable, fruit, bread, beverage. But instead of inmates lining up cafeteria style, officers push carts loaded with trays down each tier, stopping at each door. The inmate inside receives the tray through a slot. The process is methodical and slow. Module D, with its 4 wings and 368 inmates, takes 2 hours and 11 minutes to feed. During this time, the trays sit on the carts, cooling. The protein congeals. The vegetable loses texture. It's still nutritionally adequate and it meets contractual standards, but it's a degraded version of what was planned. Small humiliations like this accumulate during lockdown, stacking into resentment that has nowhere to go. An inmate, interviewed for a re-entry program case study, remembered it this way. You tell yourself it's just food. It's just one meal. But when every meal is like that for 3 days, you start feeling like you're being erased. The lockdown continues. At 13:02, the silence in Module D's common areas, normally filled with the ambient noise of movement, television, conversation, is replaced by the hollow echo of radio chatter from officers' handsets. The recreational yard, a space measuring 132 meters by 41 meters with basketball hoops and outdoor fitness equipment, sits empty. On a normal Thursday afternoon, 200 inmates would rotate through that space in 90-minute blocks. Today, the space is vacant, except for 2 officers walking the perimeter. The yard's emptiness is surreal, like seeing a highway without cars. This is what lockdown looks like from the outside. Architecture without purpose, infrastructure suspended in time. The replacement radio repeater arrives at 14:20. The maintenance crew begins installation immediately. The work requires climbing the north tower, removing the failed unit, installing the new one, testing signal strength across all modules, and certifying the system with Central Command. Estimated completion, 16 Hazkaro. The warden reviews the timeline and makes a calculated decision. Rather than lift lockdown immediately upon equipment restoration, she extends it through the evening meal and overnight. planning to restore normal operations at the Oro 6:30 morning unlock on Friday. This decision prioritizes safety over convenience. Starting and stopping lockdown creates windows of confusion, moments when inmates and staff are uncertain which protocols apply. It's safer, the reasoning goes, to maintain lockdown through a full cycle and resume cleanly. The decision adds another 14 hours to the lockdown clock. The decision also adds another $58,000 to the cost. What happens during extended lockdown is a slow-motion stress test of every system. The facility's telephone system, which normally handles between 800 and 1,200 calls per day, processes 0. Each of those unreceived calls represents a connection between an inmate and the outside world. A conversation that might have been with a spouse, a child, an elderly parent, an attorney, a potential employer. Those conversations don't pause. They vanish. The mail delivery, which occurs every afternoon at 14:30, is delayed because distributing mail during lockdown requires officers to go cell by cell, and the officers are already stretched managing meal delivery and the ongoing manual counts. The education programs, which serve as both rehabilitation and occupation, simply don't happen. The 207 inmates enrolled in those programs spend the day in their cells instead of learning welding, studying for GD exams, or attending cognitive behavioral therapy sessions. Every hour of programming missed is an hour of potential progress lost. Recidivism studies consistently show that inmates who complete educational and vocational programs during incarceration have reoffense rates 23 to 29% lower than those who don't. Lockdown doesn't just freeze the present, it mortgages the future. By 17:30, the radio system is fully operational and certified. The warden receives confirmation and reaffirms her decision to maintain lockdown overnight. Central Command notifies all modules. Officers prepare for dinner distribution, which will follow the same cell-by-cell protocol as lunch. In Module D, Wing 3, Trevor Hastings in cell 347 hears the announcement over the intercom and shrugs. He has survived 22 months. He will survive another night. Raymond Park, his cellmate, is less sanguine. He punches the wall once, hard enough to make a sound, but not hard enough to injure himself or draw official attention. The frustration is visible, but contained. This is the skill inmates develop, the ability to be angry in ways that don't escalate. The dinner service begins at 18 hours and follows the same exhausting pattern. Officers, now working their 11th consecutive hour, push carts, distribute trays, and log each delivery. The facility, built to move, creaks under the weight of stillness. By 1945, all inmates have been fed. The evening stretches ahead with nothing to fill it. No television access in common areas because the common areas are locked. No recreation because the gym and yard are closed. No phone calls, no visits. Just cells, silence, and time. At 21:03, a second alarm sounds in Module C, Wing 2. This is not a medical emergency. This is a Level 2 disturbance, the official designation for an inmate acting out in a way that threatens safety but hasn't crossed into violence. The details emerge over the radio. An inmate, frustrated by the extended lockdown, has barricaded his cell door by wedging a mattress against it and is refusing to communicate with staff. Under normal operations, this would be managed through negotiation, possibly involving a mental health professional. During lockdown, the response options narrow. A tactical team is assembled. The team consists of 6 officers in protective gear. They approach the cell, remove the mattress, and restrain the inmate using approved techniques. The entire incident lasts 9 minutes. The inmate is evaluated by medical staff, found to be uninjured, and placed in administrative segregation for observation. The paperwork generated by this single incident fills 27 pages. A facility investigator, writing in a use of force review, noted, "The subject's behavior was a direct response to environmental stressors created by extended lockdown. In isolation, the incident is minor. In context, it's predictable." The night continues. Officers work through their shifts, rotating posts as personnel allows. Inmates sleep or try to. The facility, lit by fluorescent overheads that never fully dim, hums with mechanical ventilation and distant radio chatter. The building doesn't rest, it waits. Lockdown imposes a kind of temporal distortion, where minutes stretch and hours compress. The experience is simultaneously boring and anxious, empty and oppressive. Friday morning arrives. At 6:30, the morning unlock sequence begins. The lockdown, in effect for 23 hours and 43 minutes, is lifted. Doors open. Inmates emerge. The facility resumes its programmed motion. Breakfast is served in the dining hall. Work crews report to their assignments. Education classes reconvene. The phone system comes back online. Visiting hours are reinstated. The machine starts running again, and within 2 hours, it's as if the lockdown never happened. Except it did, and everyone inside knows it. The cost accounting begins in the days that follow. The finance office tallies the overtime, the contractor fees, the food service penalties, the rescheduling costs. The final number, recorded in an internal memorandum never released publicly, but obtained through a legislative request, comes to $63,470 for a lockdown lasting less than 24 hours. That figure doesn't include the intangible costs. The educational hours lost, the family visits canceled, the psychological toll on staff and inmates, the increased tension that will manifest in the following weeks as minor infractions spike and tempers fray. Those costs are real, but unquantifiable, so they're omitted from the official accounting. Behind the scenes, an entire industry exists to support the infrastructure of lockdown. The radio equipment at Riverside is manufactured by a defense contractor that also supplies communication systems to military installations. The contract for radio equipment maintenance across the state's 14 correctional facilities is worth $6 million annually. The food service provider operates under a 5-year contract worth $41 million statewide. The mandatory overtime protocols are governed by union agreements negotiated over decades. The facility's insurance policies, which cover everything from inmate medical care to staff injury to civil liability, cost the state $1.4 million per year just for Riverside. Lockdown activates every one of these systems simultaneously, stressing them and generating costs that ripple outward through the entire apparatus. This is what most people never see. The prison is not just a building with cells and officers. It's an economic ecosystem with suppliers, contractors, insurers, unions, oversight bodies, and legal frameworks, all interconnected and all dependent on the facility functioning smoothly. When lockdown stops the facility, the ecosystem still runs, burning resources without producing outcomes. The training required for staff to manage lockdown is extensive and ongoing. New officers at Riverside complete 160 hours of academy training before they ever step inside the facility. 48 of those hours focus specifically on emergency protocols, including lockdown procedures. Every year, officers complete 24 hours of in-service training, refreshing their knowledge on use of force, medical response, and crisis de-escalation. The state's Corrections Training Division employs 83 full-time instructors and operates 2 regional academies. The annual budget for training across the state system is $9 million. All of this exists because lockdown, despite being an extraordinary measure, is also routine. Riverside has executed 17 full or partial lockdowns in the past 3 years. Across the state's 14 facilities, lockdowns occur approximately 130 times per year. The system is designed to handle them because they're inevitable. Equipment fails, staff shortages happen, tensions escalate. The question is never if a lockdown will occur, but when. The recognition of lockdowns' costs and consequences has begun to shift policy in some jurisdictions. A report from the National Institute of Corrections, published in collaboration with university researchers and corrections professionals, recommended that facilities adopt least restrictive alternatives to full lockdowns, including partial lockdowns that affect only specific modules or wings rather than entire institutions. The report cited evidence that targeted responses reduce costs by 61% while maintaining security. Several states have piloted programs to improve maintenance on critical systems like radios, surveillance cameras, and door controls, reducing equipment failure lockdowns by 38%. Staff retention initiatives, including better pay and mental health support, have decreased staffing shortage lockdowns. These reforms are slow, incremental, and expensive to implement, but the data suggests they pay for themselves within 18 months by avoiding the catastrophic costs of repeated total lockdowns. The human element, however, resists neat policy solutions. Officer Chen, who started the day trying to unlock cell 347, finishes his shift 26 hours later, exhausted and irritable. He drives home in silence, too tired to listen to the radio. He thinks about the door that didn't open, the cascade of consequences that followed, and the strange injustice that 3 seconds of radio silence can trap 1,500 people in place. He doesn't think of himself as part of a system or cost center or policy debate. He thinks about his daughter's school play that he missed, the dinner that went cold, the morning he'll spend sleeping instead of fixing the garage door. The lockdown hurt him too, in small ways that accumulate. Trevor Hastings, back in cell 347, resumes his routine. He works the morning shift in the facility's warehouse, moving inventory. He attends his GED class in the afternoon. He calls his sister at 18:20, their scheduled weekly call. She asks how he's doing. He says fine, doesn't mention the lockdown, doesn't explain that he spent 24 hours locked in a 63-square-foot cell for reasons beyond his control or understanding. There's no point. She wouldn't understand, and explaining would only make her worry. So he asks about her kids, listens to stories about soccer practice and school projects, and when the 15-minute call ends, he feels both connected and isolated. This is the permanent condition of incarceration, the paradox of being surrounded by people while fundamentally alone. The psychologist who described the silence as pressurized was pointing to something deeper than just noise levels. Lockdown compresses time, space, and agency into a singularity. Inmates lose the illusion of choice, the small freedoms that make incarceration tolerable. The choice of when to shower, what to eat from the commissary, whether to go to the yard or stay inside, which TV program to watch. Staff lose the autonomy of managing their posts, reduced to executing rigid protocols without variation. The building itself becomes a monument to control taken to its logical extreme. Everyone inside becomes subject to the same totalizing logic. Stop, stay, wait, obey. And in that compression, a truth emerges that nobody wants to acknowledge. The prison, designed to punish through confinement, can always make that confinement worse. There is no bottom to the capacity for restriction. The week following the lockdown sees the predicted spike in tension. Minor altercations increase. Disciplinary write-ups for insubordination and disrespect double. Medical sick calls for anxiety and stress-related complaints rise 47%. The facility's mental health staff, 2 psychologists and 4 counselors serving 1,497 inmates, are overwhelmed. Appointments are backlogged by 3 weeks. Crisis interventions increase. The lockdown's aftershocks ripple through the population, manifesting in ways that are individually small but collectively significant. A fight breaks out in the dining hall over a perceived slight. 2 inmates are injured. Both are placed in segregation. The fight generates investigations, hearings, and additional lockdowns of the specific wing where the fight occurred. The cycle perpetuates itself. Officers feel the strain as well. 2 staff members call in sick on the Monday following the lockdown, exhaustion masquerading as illness. The facility operates short-staffed, which increases stress on the officers who do show up, which makes further call-ins more likely. The Corrections Union files a grievance over mandatory overtime policies, arguing that the lockdown violated contractual limits on consecutive work hours. The grievance is denied because the contract includes exemptions for emergencies and lockdown qualifies. The denial breeds resentment, which festers, which manifests in subtle ways. Slower response times, less communication, a hardening of attitudes. The institutional trust that makes a facility functional erodes incrementally, and once eroded, it takes months to rebuild. The warden, reviewing incident reports from the post-lockdown week, recognizes the pattern. She's seen it before, she'll see it again. She drafts a memo to the State Corrections Commissioner requesting additional funding for radio system redundancies, arguing that a backup repeater would have prevented the entire cascade. The request is denied due to budget constraints. The memo joins dozens of similar requests in a file of unfunded needs. The system limps forward, functional but fragile, always one equipment failure away from another freeze. What the public rarely understands is that prison lockdown is a mirror. It reflects the tensions, priorities, and contradictions of the society that built the prison. We demand safety, but underfund maintenance. We require accountability, but resist transparency. We expect rehabilitation, but starve programs. We insist on humane conditions, but accept overcrowding. Lockdown makes all of these contradictions visible because it strips away the routines and distractions that normally obscure them. When the facility stops, you can see exactly what it is. A fragile machine holding fragile people in a fragile balance, sustained by protocols and budgets and personnel that are always stretched too thin. The radio repeater that failed at Riverside was installed in 2011. Its expected service life was 12 years. It lasted 13. The replacement unit, installed during the lockdown, has an expected service life of 10 years due to improvements in technology. But it's only as reliable as the maintenance schedule, the budget allocations, and the personnel trained to repair it. Someday, it too will fail. When it does, the cycle will repeat. The doors will stop opening, the facility will freeze, the costs will accumulate, and everyone inside will be reminded that the architecture of control is only as strong as its weakest component. The industry that supports corrections is vast and largely invisible. Manufacturers produce everything from handcuffs to surveillance cameras to industrial kitchen equipment specifically designed for institutional use. Contractors provide food, medical care, telecommunications, laundry services, maintenance, and transportation. Consultants advise on policy, design, and operations. Training companies certify staff. Insurance companies underwrite risk. Legal firms navigate liability. The corrections sector represents an annual domestic expenditure of $81 billion across federal, state, and local systems. Lockdown is woven into that expenditure as a predictable cost, a line item that recurs with statistical regularity. The more facilities you operate, the more lockdowns you'll experience, and the more you'll spend managing them. State oversight bodies review lockdown incidents as part of their monitoring responsibilities. Every lockdown generates documentation that must be filed, reviewed, and analyzed. Patterns are identified. Recommendations are issued. Facilities are graded on their lockdown frequency and duration. But oversight is only as effective as the resources allocated to enforcement. A state inspector, quoted in a legislative hearing transcript, explained it bluntly. "We can recommend all we want. If there's no funding to implement the recommendations, they stay recommendations. The facilities know it. We know it. Nothing changes." The families of inmates at Riverside learned about the lockdown only when they arrived for scheduled visits and were turned away. Some had driven 3 hours. Some had brought children. Some had taken unpaid time off work. They received apologies and rescheduling offers, but the damage was done. Trust in the system, already tenuous, eroded further. A family advocacy organization, working with inmates' relatives, documented these experiences in a report submitted to the state legislature. The report included testimony from 16 families, all describing similar frustrations. Lack of communication, wasted trips, and the feeling that their loved ones had disappeared into a void. One mother, whose son is serving 8 years at Riverside, wrote, "For one day, I had no way to know if he was okay. The phone didn't work. The visit was canceled. I called the facility and they said he was fine but couldn't tell me anything else. I drove home and cried because I realized how powerless I am." The educational instructor who was sent home during the lockdown, a man named Paul Hendricks, who teaches carpentry through a vocational partnership with the state's community college system, lost a day of instruction that can't be recovered. His program runs on a fixed calendar, aligned with the college's semester schedule. Missing a day means compressing content or cutting material entirely. His students, inmates working toward certificates that will help them find employment after release, fell behind. Some will catch up, some won't. The difference between those outcomes can be a single day of missed instruction. Hendricks, interviewed for a corrections education study, said, "I teach because I believe people can change, but change requires time and consistency. Lockdown steals both." The nurse who responded to the cardiac emergency in Module F during the lockdown has thought about those 18 minutes many times since. In a healthcare journal article about emergency response in correctional settings, she contributed anonymously to a roundtable discussion. "You train for the emergency. You prepare for the obstacles. But you can't prepare for the feeling when you're standing at a locked door, waiting for authorization, while someone's heart is failing on the other side." Those minutes are carved into my memory. We reached him in time. But that's luck as much as skill. Next time, we might not be lucky. The inmate who barricaded his cell in Module C has a disciplinary hearing 3 weeks after the incident. The hearing officer reviews the facts, hears from the inmate and the responding officers, and renders a decision. The inmate is found guilty of disobeying a direct order and creating a disturbance. His sentence is 30 days loss of privileges, including phone and commissary access. The decision is legally sound and procedurally correct, but it's also circular. The lockdown created the stress that caused the behavior that resulted in punishment that will create more stress. The inmate, a 31-year-old man named Jordan Miles, serving 4 years for drug possession, understands the logic perfectly. When asked if he has anything to say before the hearing concludes, he replies, "I know I messed up. But you locked us down for a day over a radio, and now you're locking me down for a month because I couldn't handle it. That's not justice. That's just more lockdown. The truth in his statement is uncomfortable. The prison system, built on the premise of measured and proportionate punishment, often operates in ways that multiply suffering without producing justice. Lockdown is the distilled essence of this dysfunction. A tool meant to preserve order that generates disorder, a safety measure that creates danger, a temporary solution that produces permanent consequences. And yet the system continues to deploy it because the alternatives, imperfect communication, tolerated risk, are unthinkable within the institutional logic of corrections. The final accounting of the March 14th lockdown at Riverside is never made public. The costs are absorbed into annual budgets. The incidents are filed in databases accessed only by researchers and policymakers. The human experiences fade into the background hum of institutional memory. Officer Chen continues working, counting down the years until retirement. Trevor Hastings continues serving his sentence, counting down the days until release. The warden continues managing a facility that's perpetually overcrowded and underfunded. The radio repeater continues transmitting signals that hold the entire structure together until the day it doesn't. Thursday, March 14th, 2024, 06:47 a.m. State Correctional Facility at Riverside, Module D, Wing 3. Officer Marcus Chen inserts his key into cell door 347. The door clicks and swings open. Trevor Hastings steps out, nods to the officer, and walks toward the dining hall. The day proceeds as planned. Breakfast is served. Work assignments are completed. Classes are attended. Visits occur. Phone calls connect. The facility moves forward, every door opening on schedule, every routine executing flawlessly, every person inside navigating the scripted choreography of incarceration. This is not the reality of that Thursday. This is the alternative timeline, the path not taken, the day that didn't happen because 3 seconds of silence triggered a cascade that cost $63,000 and revealed that when a prison stops, silence is the only sound that remains. The mythology of lockdown persists in popular imagination because it satisfies a narrative craving for drama. We want to believe that prisons are perpetually on the edge of chaos, that lockdowns represent heroic interventions against imminent violence, that the walls contain barely suppressed anarchy. The reality is more mundane and more disturbing. Most lockdowns are administrative accidents, mechanical failures dressed up as security responses. They happen because a door sensor malfunctions, because 2 officers call in sick on the same shift, because a software update crashes the surveillance system, because a delivery truck arrives 3 hours late and throws off the meal schedule. These are not Hollywood scenarios. They're bureaucratic failures with human costs that compound exponentially. The psychological research on prolonged lockdown reveals patterns that corrections administrators rarely discuss publicly. A longitudinal study conducted across 9 facilities over 4 years, published in a criminal justice psychology journal, found that inmates who experienced 3 or more lockdowns lasting 72 hours or longer within a 12-month period showed measurable increases in symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress, including hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and difficulty with impulse control. The study's lead researcher, a clinical psychologist with 18 years of corrections experience, noted in the discussion section, "We're creating trauma in the name of preventing trauma. The lockdown that stops one violent incident may generate the psychological conditions that produce 3 more incidents months later. We're not solving problems. We're displacing them in time." The ripple effects extend beyond the walls. When Riverside locked down on March 14th, 43 inmates missed scheduled video visits with their children. These visits, arranged through a state program designed to maintain family bonds during incarceration, are limited to one per month per family. Missing a visit means waiting 30 days for the next opportunity. For a 5-year-old child, 30 days is an eternity. For a parent trying to maintain a meaningful relationship across barriers of distance and stigma, 30 days represents a wound that reopens with each missed connection. A social worker specializing in children of incarcerated parents, speaking at a national conference on family services, described the cascade. The child doesn't understand lockdown or security protocols or radio failures. The child understands that Daddy promised to be on the screen and Daddy wasn't there. That breaks trust. And once trust is broken between a parent and child, separated by incarceration, rebuilding it is agonizingly difficult. The economic analysis of lockdown extends into second and third-order effects that rarely appear in cost-benefit calculations. When educational programming is interrupted, inmates enrolled in college courses through partnership programs with local universities fall behind in coursework that operates on fixed academic calendars. These programs, funded through a patchwork of grants, state allocations, and nonprofit partnerships, have strict completion timelines tied to accreditation requirements. An inmate pursuing an associate degree who misses a week of classes due to repeated lockdowns may fail to complete enough credits to stay enrolled, triggering withdrawal from the program entirely. The cost of that withdrawal includes the tuition already paid, the potential lifetime earnings differential between a released inmate with a degree versus one without, and the recidivism cost if the loss of educational opportunity contributes to reoffense. A corrections education policy analyst testifying before a state budget committee quantified this. Every inmate who fails to complete a degree program due to institutional disruptions like lockdown costs the state an estimated $147,000 over 10 years in increased recidivism probability and associated criminal justice costs. The infrastructure required to execute a lockdown reveals the hidden architecture of the modern prison. Riverside's Central Command Center, where the decision to initiate lockdown originates and where all lockdown operations are coordinated, is a room measuring 400 square feet, equipped with 37 monitors, displaying feeds from 283 cameras positioned throughout the facility. The center operates 24 hours a day with a minimum of 3 staff members per shift: a command officer, a communications technician, and a surveillance monitor. The equipment in that room, including the servers that store camera footage, the software that manages door controls, and the radio base station that connects to repeaters like the one that failed, represents a capital investment of $1.7 million. That equipment has an expected operational lifespan of 7 to 9 years, meaning the facility must budget for replacement on a rolling cycle. When a lockdown occurs due to failure in any component of this system, the failure represents not just an immediate operational crisis, but a sign that the replacement cycle is falling behind the degradation curve. The training that prepares officers for lockdown includes scenarios that attempt to simulate the psychological pressure of extended confinement. During academy training, recruits participate in exercises where they spend 8 hours in a small room with one other person, mimicking the conditions inmates experience during lockdown. The exercise is designed to build empathy and understanding, to help officers recognize the stress that accumulates when movement and choice are eliminated. A training instructor, quoted in a corrections workforce development manual, explained the pedagogy. "We can teach tactics and procedures in a classroom. We can't teach what it feels like to be trapped until we trap them." Most recruits emerge from that exercise with a new appreciation for how hard it is to simply sit and wait. Some emerge with doubts about whether they want this career. Both outcomes are valuable. The legal framework surrounding lockdown is surprisingly sparse. Federal courts have established that lockdowns must be reasonably related to a legitimate penological interest, that they cannot be arbitrary or capricious, and that they cannot constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. But the threshold for what constitutes reasonable is high. Courts defer heavily to prison administrators' judgment on security matters, recognizing that judges are not corrections experts. This deference means that lockdowns, even those lasting weeks or months, are rarely successfully challenged in litigation. An attorney specializing in prisoners' rights litigation, writing in a law review article, summarized the legal landscape. The doctrine of deference has created a virtually unreviewable zone of administrative discretion. Absent evidence of malice or deliberate indifference to serious medical needs, lockdowns survive legal challenge almost automatically. Inmates challenging lockdowns face a burden of proof that's nearly impossible to meet. The variance in lockdown practices across different facilities within the same state system reveals the extent to which local management decisions shape institutional culture. While Riverside executed 17 lockdowns in 3 years, another facility of similar size and security level 60 miles away executed only 4 lockdowns in the same period. The difference isn't attributable to inmate behavior or facility age. The difference is leadership philosophy. The warden at the facility with fewer lockdowns prioritizes equipment maintenance, invests in staff training focused on de-escalation, and maintains a policy of using partial lockdowns targeting specific areas rather than facility-wide freezes except in cases of genuine emergency. A corrections consultant who has evaluated management practices at 32 facilities across 6 states observed, "The number of lockdowns a facility experiences is less a function of security needs and more a function of management competence. Good leaders prevent lockdowns. Poor leaders react with lockdowns." The supply chain that keeps a facility operating during lockdown is fragile and complex. Riverside receives food deliveries 3 times per week on a contracted schedule. The kitchen maintains a 72-hour emergency supply of shelf-stable meals in case deliveries are disrupted. But those meals are nutritionally adequate emergency rations, not the regular menu. During the March 14th lockdown, the facility didn't need to tap emergency supplies because the lockdown lasted less than 24 hours. But longer lockdowns create supply challenges. Medical supplies, particularly medications that must be dispensed daily, can't be stockpiled indefinitely due to expiration dates and controlled substance regulations. A lockdown that prevents routine deliveries or disrupts the pharmacy's distribution process can create situations where inmates miss doses of critical medications. A facility pharmacist, speaking at a correctional healthcare conference, described the tightrope. "We operate just in time for most medications. We don't have the storage space or budget to maintain deep reserves. A lockdown that extends past 48 hours starts creating medication continuity problems that can have serious health consequences." The technology that failed at Riverside, the radio repeater, represents a category of equipment that correction systems nationwide struggle to maintain. A survey conducted by the Association of State Correctional Administrators found that 43% of state facilities are operating communication systems that have exceeded their expected service life. And 61% of facilities report having inadequate budget allocations for technology replacement and upgrades. The underfunding is structural. Legislatures approve corrections, budgets focused on staffing and operations, the visible costs. Technology infrastructure is invisible until it fails, at which point the failure becomes an emergency requiring supplemental funding. This reactive cycle means facilities are perpetually behind the technology curve, operating equipment that's outdated and vulnerable to failure. A state corrections technology director, testifying at a budget hearing, made the case plainly. We're trying to run a 21st century security operation on infrastructure designed in the 1990s. Every lockdown caused by equipment failure is a warning that we're ignoring until the system collapses entirely. The impact of lockdown on prison labor programs is economically significant, but rarely calculated. Many facilities operate work programs where inmates perform tasks ranging from laundry and food service to manufacturing and data entry. These programs generate revenue that offsets operational costs, with some facilities earning between $200,000 and $800,000 annually from inmate labor contracts. When a lockdown stops these work programs, the revenue stream stops, but the contractual obligations to outside clients continue. A lockdown that lasts 1 week can cost a facility between $12,000 and $28,000 in lost labor revenue, plus potential penalties for missed contract deliverables. The inmates who work these jobs lose wages that they use to pay court-ordered restitution, child support, and to build savings for release. A lockdown doesn't just idle the workers, it interrupts their financial rehabilitation. An inmate worker at a facility in another state, interviewed for a prison labor economics study, calculated his losses. I make 32 cents an hour in the print shop. I work 40 hours a week. A 5-day lockdown costs me $12.80. That's half my monthly commissary budget. I can't buy soap or stamps. And I still owe $7,000 in restitution that I'm trying to pay down. Lockdown sets me back and there's nothing I can do about it. The historical trajectory of lockdown as a management tool shows a troubling escalation. Data compiled from correctional archives indicates that the average state facility conducted 2.7 lockdowns per year in 1995. By 2005, that number had risen to 5.4. By 2015, it reached 8.9. The most recent data from 2023 shows an average of 11.3 lockdowns per facility annually. This increase correlates with rising incarceration rates, aging infrastructure, and staffing shortages. But it also reflects a normalization of lockdown as a default response to any uncertainty. Where previous generations of corrections administrators viewed lockdown as a last resort, contemporary administrators increasingly view it as a standard management tool, deployed preemptively rather than reactively. A retired warden with 32 years of experience across 4 states reflected on this shift. When I started, lockdown meant something had gone seriously wrong. We'd have an investigation, a review, changes to policy. Now lockdowns are so common they barely generate paperwork. We've normalized dysfunction and called it professionalism. The mental health consequences for staff who work through repeated lockdowns are beginning to emerge in research literature. A study examining burnout and secondary traumatic stress in correctional officers found that exposure to 10 or more lockdown events over a 2-year period correlated with significantly elevated scores on measures of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. The core components of burnout syndrome. The study also found that officers who experienced lockdowns as particularly chaotic or poorly managed showed symptoms consistent with secondary traumatic stress, including intrusive thoughts about work, avoidance of work-related stimuli, and hyperarousal. The psychological toll on staff mirrors the toll on inmates in troubling ways. Both populations are trapped by lockdown. Both lose agency and autonomy. Both must endure conditions they didn't create and can't control. A corrections psychologist who treats both inmates and staff observed, "The wall separates their legal status, but lockdown puts everyone on the same side of suffering. The difference is that staff can eventually go home, but they carry the experience with them. It doesn't stay inside the fence." The public health dimension of lockdown is especially acute in the context of communicable disease. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Correctional facilities nationwide employed extended lockdowns as infection control measures, isolating inmates in cells for weeks or months to prevent viral spread. The strategy was epidemiologically sound, but psychologically catastrophic. Facilities that maintained lockdowns exceeding 60 days reported mental health crises, including suicide attempts, self-harm incidents, and psychotic breaks at rates 5 to 7 times higher than pre-pandemic baselines. A public health researcher who studied COVID-19 response in carceral settings concluded, "We stopped the virus from moving, but we couldn't stop the harm that stillness caused." Lockdown as infection control revealed the fundamental incompatibility between public health and incarceration. You can't isolate people who are already isolated without breaking them. The question that haunts lockdown policy is whether the security gained justifies the damage inflicted. Every lockdown is premised on the assumption that stopping all movement prevents a specific harm. But the counterfactual is unknowable. At Riverside, the 3-second radio gap that triggered the March 14th lockdown could have resulted in a security breach, or it could have resolved itself without incident. There's no way to know because the lockdown prevented any outcome except stasis. This creates a logical trap. Lockdowns are justified by threats that may or may not exist. And because the lockdown prevents those threats from manifesting, it's impossible to determine whether the threats were real. A criminologist studying correctional decision-making described this as the prevention paradox. Every lockdown that prevents nothing appears to have prevented something. Every lockdown that was unnecessary appears to have been necessary. The system rewards caution over precision, and the cost of that reward is paid by people who have no choice but to pay it. The facilities that have successfully reduced lockdown frequency share common characteristics: investment in redundant systems, commitment to staff training and retention, emphasis on communication between administration and line staff, and willingness to accept calculated risks rather than defaulting to lockdown at the first sign of uncertainty. These facilities are not less secure. They're more intelligently managed. A national survey of corrections administrators identified 12 model facilities with significantly below-average lockdown rates and significantly below-average incident rates, demonstrating that security and restraint are not synonymous. The survey's findings challenged conventional wisdom. A facility with fewer lockdowns can be safer than a facility that locks down frequently. The key variable is institutional competence. Lockdown is what happens when systems fail. Preventing lockdown means preventing failure. The cost of building lockdown resilience into a facility from the ground up is substantial but recoverable. A new facility designed with redundant power systems, backup communication networks, modern door control mechanisms, adequate staffing areas, and sufficient program space operates with approximately 18% higher capital costs than a facility built to minimum specifications. But over a 20-year operational lifespan, the facility with resilient systems experiences 63% fewer equipment failure, lockdowns, resulting in operational savings that exceed the initial capital premium within 11 years. Several states have begun incorporating these design principles into new construction. But the majority of the nation's correctional infrastructure was built decades ago under different standards. Retrofitting older facilities is prohibitively expensive, which means most institutions will continue to operate with vulnerable systems that fail regularly and predictably. The human capacity to adapt to lockdown is both remarkable and tragic. Inmates develop coping strategies. They sleep more, they exercise in confined spaces, they read, they meditate, they dissociate. These adaptations are survival mechanisms, but they come at a cost. The psychological flexibility required to tolerate repeated lockdowns is the same flexibility that makes successful re-entry difficult. Learning to survive in a locked cell teaches skills that are maladaptive in free society. A re-entry counselor working with formerly incarcerated individuals described the pattern. I see clients who spent years adapting to lockdown conditions, learning to shut down emotionally, to trust no one, to expect nothing. Then we release them and ask them to get jobs, maintain relationships, engage with their communities. We've trained them for a world that doesn't exist outside and then punish them for not adapting to the world that does. It's cruel. The future of lockdown policy is uncertain. Some jurisdictions are exploring alternatives, including enhanced surveillance technology that reduces reliance on human monitoring, thereby reducing staffing shortage lockdowns. Others are piloting programs that use mental health professionals and peer mediators to de-escalate tensions before they require lockdowns. A few progressive systems have adopted policies limiting lockdown duration and requiring documented justification for extensions beyond 48 hours. But these reforms exist at the margins. The overwhelming majority of facilities continue to operate under traditional models where lockdown remains the primary tool for managing any deviation from routine. Changing this requires not just policy reforms, but cultural transformation within corrections. And culture changes slowly when the people most harmed by current practices have no power to demand change. The March 14th lockdown at Riverside ended. The days that followed were tense but manageable. The facility returned to its rhythm of controlled motion, its carefully calibrated balance between restriction and programming. Officer Chen continued his career, counting years toward retirement. Trevor Hastings continued his sentence, counting days toward release. The warden continued managing impossible demands with inadequate resources. The radio repeater continued functioning until eventually it won't. And when it fails, the cycle will begin again. The door that doesn't open. The cascade of consequences. The facility that stops breathing. The silence that costs everything. What nobody in control wanted to admit was that lockdown isn't an exception to the system. Lockdown is the system revealing itself. Every prison operates one mistake away from total paralysis, one failure away from the moment when the illusion of control becomes the reality of stasis. The architecture, the protocols, the training, the technology, all of it exists to prevent that moment. But prevention is imperfect. Failure is inevitable. And when the moment arrives, the only thing left is the choice between acknowledging the system's fragility or pretending the lockdown was always necessary, always justified, always the right response to a threat that may never have existed. Thursday, March 14th, 2024. 06:47 a.m. Cell door 347 doesn't open. The silence that follows costs $63,000 and answers the question nobody wanted to ask. What is control worth when measured in frozen time, canceled visits, missed classes, and the quiet desperation of 1,500 people waiting for a door to unlock? The answer is written in the budget lines that hide the cost, in the incident reports that justify the decision, in the faces of children who wait for video calls that never connect, in the exhaustion of officers who work 26-hour shifts, in the resignation of inmates who have learned that the punishment never really ends because it can always get worse. When a prison stops, silence becomes currency, time becomes punishment, and the door that was always locked becomes the door that won't ever open again until someone somewhere decides that 3 seconds of uncertainty has been adequately answered by 24 hours of certainty. Control, it turns out, is just another word for the moment before everything stops.